In this episode, we're going to be talking about hey, what's going on here? What's happening to the color? Who are you?
Submitted for your approval, as all digital media is today. A group of individuals seeking shelter. From what? We don't know. Will they get there? Perhaps. The one thing that we do know is you never want to seek shelter in the Twilight Tube Zone.
I've loved the Twilight Zone ever since I was a young kid. At some point, I'll probably talk about the Jordan Peele updated series, but for now, I just want others to fall in love with the original series like I did. Now, most people who know about the Twilight Zone tend to love it for its timeless plot twists. The original series offers some of the best sci fi writing around, from authors like Richard Matheson. When you're younger, I think these plot twists make the show exciting and keep you coming back for more. To serve man, time enough at last. The monsters are due on Maple Street. These are just some of the amazing episodes, some of the most must watch episodes. Not because they're the best, but because they're the ones that most people know, which means you can talk about them with others, and that's always fun. Once you've been initiated into the Twilight Zone fan club, you can begin to start appreciating the other episodes as well. At 40, I find myself more drawn to the episodes that deal with the passages of time. Things like One for the Angels, A Game of Pool, or Walking Distance. But there's another genre of episode in the Twilight Zone as well that is, in my opinion, the most horrifying of all. And that's the ones that deal with the full breadth of humanity, the ugliness, the savagery, the willingness to step over each other in order to move up just an inch in the world. And it's here that I want to make my first stop in reviewing the Twilight Zone by talking about what I believe is the most frightening episode of all, The Shelter. Now, in order to grasp why this episode is so horrifying, you have to understand what was going on in America in the early 60s when this episode originally aired. The threat of nuclear war filtered the air we breathed, the very thoughts in our mind. When you watch some of the old films and the old posters about what to do in case of a nuclear blast, we tend to take these as jokes today. We mock them for their ignorance. Certainly, ducking and covering under a desk is probably not going to save you from a nuclear blast. I do think, however, we need to consider that at the time, the main concern probably had more to do with instilling in people a sense of confidence and giving them a strategy for a potentially horrific future event that would have been almost cataclysmic. So, what were you supposed to do to prepare for such a horrible event? Well, you built a shelter. The goals for these shelter, of course, were essentially to keep your family safe for about roughly 2 weeks, maybe a little bit more. The government even issued a booklet entitled The Family Fallout Shelter. Let me read you a brief section from this booklet that will give you a better idea about where our mindset was in the country. It states, "We do not want a war. We do not know whether there will be a war. But we know that forces hostile to us possess weapons that could destroy us if we were unready. These weapons create a new threat, radioactive fallout that can spread death anywhere. This is why we must prepare." Now, in these words, you can hear this urgent call to action in the face of chaotic uncertainty. The fallout can spread anywhere. And the only way to stop chaos is to assert control. So in building your shelter, you're essentially building a controlled environment, a little space from which you can say, "Not today, Mr. Fallout." In this government-issued booklet, it literally gives families plans for building a shelter in their homes. It even offers guidelines for dealing with potential problems that might arise in the shelter, such as bored children. And how does the government think you should deal with your bored child? Well, provide simple recreation and tasks, meaning chores. Could you imagine taking away a child's iPad or smartphone today? I'm pretty sure most parents would take their chances outside the shelter. All kidding aside, I reiterate, you cannot appreciate the horror that is this episode unless you accept this one fact. Nuclear war was a real threat. People really thought they were about to be incinerated or burned/poisoned by fallout, and a shelter was considered one of the only ways that you could protect your family. And that takes me to the episode itself. Now, I can't really do my review without spoiling the episode somewhat, so If you want to come back to this video after watching the Twilight Zone episode, I'll give a timestamp below to make that a little bit easier. Now, the episode opens up on a birthday party for local neighborhood doctor Bill Stockton. It's a very happy suburban area. The neighbors are laughing, they're eating cake, and they make the kind of jokes about each other that are biting but not mean-spirited. One of those jokes has to do with all the racket that the doctor has been creating over the last few months in building his bomb shelter. For now, these are only jokes, but they will cease to be funny when the Conelrad station announces over the air that unidentified flying objects are heading for the United States. Now, just some history here. The Conelrad station was a national emergency broadcast station that was created in case of nuclear attack. Here is a sample of the Conelrad station from the 1960s.
Here is a special and urgent message for you. This is Howard Viken, your official civil defense announcer. Civil defense authorities have determined that it is advisable for all persons to leave the city. Your safety and perhaps your life depends on remaining calm and following these instructions.
If you heard the Conelrad station come on, you knew that something was wrong and that you had to listen. So when this birthday party is interrupted by the Conelrad station, they know that something's wrong, and they scatter out of the house like cockroaches. As they leave the house, you can hear these unidentified flying objects whizzing overhead. In their minds, it's finally happening. It's going down. Nuclear war has started. Now, at this point, the doctor has begun prepping his shelter with supplies. As he sends his son back upstairs to go get some tools, we see an interesting scene happen between the doctor and his wife. The wife is clearly despondent. She's sort of just floating around the room looking at little toys and things like that. And then she asks this question: is it so necessary to survive? For a brief moment, she doesn't want to picture a world in ruins with all of the things that she has grown to love simply gone. I think we can understand why she might think this, even if we disagree with her. But her husband reminds her that they have a son, and that son deserves to have a life. Now let's pause again for a moment and recalibrate history a bit. The notion of living in fear of imminent death is not something that was invented during the Cold War, and it's not something that went away when the Cold War ended. Humans have always lived under the notion that everything can be taken away from them at any moment. But when you live this kind of magical, well-put-together life, as the people in this episode do, the threat of nuclear war becomes almost as fantastical as Jack and the Beanstalk. They can no longer fathom why anything would possibly disturb their wonderful existence. But for those individuals who are exposed to this type of horror every day, the possibility of destruction, simply getting up in the morning can be a heroic act of defiance, a way to tell the chaotic forces of destruction, you're going to have to catch me if you want me. Now, just as the doctor is about to enter his shelter and close the door, he starts to get visits from his neighbors, the same friends who were quite literally celebrating his birth, his existence, just about an hour ago. And as you can guess, they want entrance into the shelter. The problem, of course, is that the shelter was built to only hold the 3 family members, the father, the mother, and the son. Now, the doctor tells his friends that he can't help them. They simply need to find their own means of survival. Now, the neighbors outside of the shelter start to turn on each other. They find ways of categorizing who's more worthy of saving than the others. Families with babies, people who were born in the country versus those who emigrated there. They use every trick in the book to try and see who is more worthy of life. And we still do this today, of course. Remember, there are 2 ways to get ahead of others. You can continually work hard and move ahead of that person, or you can tear the person next to you down. Now, when you tear the person down next to you, you also tear away at your own humanity. You become that which we should all fear: inhumane. Now, by the end of the episode, the neighbors have grown desperate. The bombs are on their way. They take a long lead pipe and bash the shelter door in, thus rendering it virtually useless for protection against fallout. They essentially kill the doctor and his family. Just as they're ripping the door open, the Conelrad station comes back on the air and tells them that the objects have actually been ascertained as being simply satellites. There is no nuclear threat. Now, at this point, everybody's adrenaline is beginning to sort of subside, and clearer thoughts are coming into play. The neighbors are hugging each other, they're smiling, and then it hits them. They finally realize what they've actually done. As the doctor says in his closing monologue, they've been spared a bomb, but they've essentially been destroyed anyway. Now, of course, he doesn't mean literally, but they can never return to a state of ignorance about life, about what they were willing to do in order to remain alive. The doctor himself even questions how easy it was for him to turn on his friends, his patients, and turn his back on even his Hippocratic oath. Now, I love this episode. It's one of my favorite episodes. I like it because you're not supposed to simply make the doctor into a victim, nor are you supposed to believe that he's a villain. No one looks good in this picture, and if no one looks good in the picture, the only real answer is to make sure it never happens. And that means we need to do work to make sure that we create a world in which we are able to maintain our humanity. There will always be strife. There will always be conflict. That's a part of being human. But we must do everything possible to avoid those. The creator of the Twilight Zone, Rod Serling, says it best in his closing narration. He says, "No moral, no message, no prophetic tract. Just a simple statement of fact. For civilization to survive, the human race has to remain civilized." One very small exercise in logic from the Twilight Zone. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate your subscription to the channel. My upload schedule is set for Saturdays for main episodes like this, with short episodes and reactions every so often in between the week. Thank you for your time. As always, I appreciate it, and until next time, keep hope, keep humanity, stay civilized.